When you're designing e-learning courses and lessons, one of the steps that you'll want to go through is developing a development plan and a style guide. Now, a development plan and style guide are essentially a roadmap that you will use when you go about actually creating your materials. Now, if you're working just by yourself, these sort of issues become less important, although you'll still want to think through the issues. But if you're working in teams, these tools become absolutely critical because it's a way of ensuring a consistent look and feel, as well as strategies when you go about developing your course or your lessons. So from the experiences I've had of working with teams, this is a critical investment in time and steps to make sure that you're developing a very cohesive and consistent e-learning product at the end. What I have here and displaying for you is a diagram or a mind map of the key questions and elements that you'll want to make sure you include in any sort of development plan and style guide. Now, there's a lot of different ways that these can be visualized. For example, you could actually create a mind map such as this and add information around the sides here that actually indicate the answers to these questions. So that would be one method. Other people actually might use a more formal template, a written template to do this. A lot of this is based on what the organization has in mind in terms of their requirements. But also it's using methods that are visually easy to see and understand. So here I'm going to walk through just a few of the questions, but also leave you a good amount of freedom as you're developing your own to actually create a format that works for you and works for your client that you're working with. So the first thing that I want to talk through here are technology issues. I'm going to zoom in here so we can kind of take a look at those for a second. Now, technology is a big part, as you would guess, of online learning, but there are many different criteria that you're going to want to think about. But these are 5 main questions that I would recommend that you consider. The first one dealing with here is how will learners progress and how will the learners' progress and completion data be tracked? So are you going to be putting this in a learning management system? Are you going to be putting it on a website somewhere? What sort of requirements will you have for tracking that data when learners go through it? If you don't have requirements for tracking that, a simple website might be appropriate. However, if you do have to track who is using the training, are they completing it with their score, you're going to want to think of using some sort of learning management system. So those are some things you want to think about. Next is what types of media will you use and what sort of technical standards will you need to follow. For example, are you using text? Are you going to be using certain images or videos? What formats will those videos need to be rendered in? If you're going to be delivering content, for example, on iOS devices like an iPad or an iPhone, you won't be able to use the Flash media player. So for example, you would have to then instead use an HTML5 type file formats, compliant file formats. So these are just examples of things you'll want to think about. Next is what technologies will the learners use to access the online materials. So I used an example of a mobile device. You'll want to think about what and how the learners will access the online learning that you're developing. Next is what are the software and hardware requirements for the learners to use the lesson or the course. Will they have good access to the internet, or will they have slow access to the internet? These are some things you'll want to consider. And from a development standpoint is what technologies will you use to develop the online materials? And ideally, all 5 of these questions work in harmony with one another. So if you're using, let's say, Flash to develop online learning materials, and yet you expect to have that content delivered on a mobile device, you're going to run into some issues there. That's why this development plan is so important to do early in the process, so you can begin to anticipate what those needs might be. All right, so here I'm going to go over here to the next category, which is interaction design. So the previous one was technology, this one is interaction design. And this gets more at the visual appeal and the visual aspects of what the lesson is about. So for example, what will the interface look like? What navigation features will you include? So how the learners will use the content you're creating. What will the screen layouts look like? How will the content be laid out? And how will accessibility and usability considerations be incorporated? The issue of accessibility is a critical one in online learning because we want to make sure that anything that we create is accessible to the widest audience possible. And so you'll want to look and think through what that process looks like and some considerations you might think about there. So these are 4 key questions for interaction design related issues. And the final main area is content design. And I recommend 3 basic questions here, although there is many more in each of these. But one might be, what style or tone will you use when you're writing your content? What sort of color palette will be used, and how are those elements repeated and reinforced throughout the material? And what are the typography, style, and size requirements that you might be dealing with? In other words, what sort of text will be used, and how is that going to be conveyed to the learner? And again, there's probably many other questions that you might think about and consider, and you'll certainly want to document those in any sort of development guide and style guide. But these basic questions will provide you a framework to begin thinking through and designing what your online learning lesson or your course will become. This is also a tool that you can go back to and reference as you get through in the development process to ensure that what you end up developing is consistent with your beginning plans and requirements that you develop from your client and that which you've built through the design process.